So first, let me tell you a little bit about this coming out as event. So Abigail Segui has done a wonderful job partnering with many of her graduate students. And one of her first partnerships with Anna Ward, who's the student we shared, was around this term coming out and how a term that was associated with the gay and lesbian movement had seemed to be being applied to people in the FAT movement. And one thing we can think about coming out is that it seems to be about an invisible identity that one has to then come out to other people. And I know Abby was thinking about the way in which that seemed an odd kind of thing for people in the FAT movement to be talking about, since they have a visible FAT presence. Since then, Abby has been partnering with many of her students, being a tremendous mentor, and seeing the course of the migration of this term. In the Center for the Study of Women, we've been very interested too in thinking about the migration of something that has been so important to social movements in LGBT, and how that migration has occurred across many different communities. And so this is an opportunity for us to hear more of that research and to help theorize along these same lines. With that, let me introduce our first speaker for today. Abby Segui is a professor of sociology and gender studies at UCLA. She partnered with CSW in organizing this colloquium, which draws from her ongoing monograph, developing monograph, examining how the narrative of coming out has traveled beyond US gay right politics and diffused to France and to other groups in the US. She has a longstanding interest in how cultural schemas shape power relations and how subordinate groups are sometimes able to create new cultural meaning to increase their control. Her books include What's Wrong with Fat, published in 2013, and What is Sexual Harassment, From Capitol Hill to the Sorbonne, published in 2003. Please help me welcome to the podium, Abby Segui.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction, for organizing, for insisting, for being very persistent in your desire to have this conference today. It's really a great opportunity for me to take stock and think about the project and where it is and where it's going. So with no further ado, I'm going to use a timer so that I stick to my 15 minutes. What does it mean to come out as a particular type of person? How and why are people using this specific term to resist various sorts of stigma and demand rights? What does the cultural schema of coming out make possible? What does the history of the term and its close association with coming out as lesbian or gay, how does that color other usages of this term? Finally, how in turn are new usages challenging the term's very meaning? In collaboration with several current or former UCLA graduate students, I have been examining these questions over the past several years. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to discuss some of the central questions and emerging findings of the broader project before two of my collaborators, Laura Enriquez and Nicola Uraga, speak about two specific case studies. So what does coming out mean? I mean, if you look up the term in the Urban Dictionary, it's quite a narrow definition that you can see here that is specifically, it is the term used by lesbians and gay men and bisexuals to describe their experience of self-discovery, self-acceptance, openness, and honesty about their sexual orientation and their decision to share this with others when and how they choose. If you look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's a broader definition, and there's several things that are listed that you can read on your own before coming to the number 5, which is to openly declare one's homosexuality. But notice also that 5 now, in the Merriam-Webster version, there's a 5A and a 5B, right? So the 5B is broader, to openly declare something about oneself previously kept hidden, often used with an as. And the example here is blew his cover and came out as a CIA agent. So this is broader definition, but it's still narrower than what I discovered when I was doing research at the Fat Acceptance Movement, in that you're revealing something hidden, a hidden stigma. So Rachel mentioned the Fat Acceptance Movement briefly. This is a small social movement comprised mostly of women that has been both a self-help and a social movement dimension. So the self-help is about helping heavy people, again, especially women, to cast off the shame, stop putting their lives on hold, stop their dangerous and counterproductive pursuit of weight loss, develop self-confidence, live emotionally and physically healthier lives, develop positive romantic relationships and friendships, and so on. So you see this aspect here with this internet campaign. I need fat acceptance because without it, I might still think people were right to hate me. I love my fat body. But it also has a social movement dimension, and this is what we see here in the other image, in which people gather together and demand, challenge weight-based discrimination and stigma, denounce the dangers of weight loss, of the weight loss industry and pharmaceutical products, and advocate for accommodations for people who don't fit within the typical accommodations. And so I was doing research at the fat acceptance movement in 2001, and I was simply asking people, tell me, how did you get involved in the fat rights movement, or the fat acceptance movement? And again, the response was, this is how I came out as a fat person. And I thought, gosh, that's really interesting and surprising, because one wouldn't think that this is revealing a hidden identity, right? That these women's body size was quite visible. This is one example from a very prominent fat acceptance activist, Marilyn Wong, who said, at that point, I was just like, living in the closet is not working. I just decided to come out as a fat person. And so this got me thinking, why this term? Why not another term? You can talk about, this asserting yourself as a fat rights person, you can use other words. So why this word? And what was this term accomplishing? And how perhaps was the meaning of the very term changing through this usage? And so I published an article that Rachel mentioned with Anna Ward in 2011, Coming Out as Fat, Rethinking Stigma, in which we grappled with this. And the first thing we asked was, is this term just something in the air that's circulating? Or was there, I thought I had another slide here. This is the one I wanted. Or in fact, was it moving across social networks? And we found that it was both. Clearly the term is in the air, but yet there was a history to how it was being used in the fat rights movement, and it was typically people who had affiliations in both, so cross-cutting memberships, or people who had connections, networks. They were in the fat acceptance movement, so they had networks and connections with people in the fat rights movement. So that started developing developing a theory for how this term was traveling. And we found that, why the term coming out, this term was very, was attractive because it helped link fat phobia to homophobia. This is this slide. This is another way in which the two movements have been linked. I think Kristen Schultz is going to talk a bit more about this connection in her talk. So, and even using this term fat phobia links it to homophobia, right? And similar to the way sexism was hearkening to racism. And so even though the term coming out is no longer the exclusive property of the gay rights movement, it still has this connotation, and it was accomplishing something very powerful. It was making this link and therefore politicizing fatness in the same way that sexual orientation has been politicized. It served to frame fat rights activists as political radicals resisting social conformity and bigotry, and thus was performing important cultural work. It also reconfigured the bounds of the term coming out itself by using it to affirm a stigmatized status that was never hidden from view, but rather was abundantly visible. To come out in this context then took on new meaning. Rather than revealing a hidden identity, it meant revealing a different worldview about a visible difference. The women came out as fat to reject the cultural assumption that they identified as thin women trapped in fat bodies, that their true thin selves would someday be revealed. Rather, by coming out as fat, they claimed their fatness as an integral part of their identity for which they demanded acknowledgement and acceptance. Okay, so this case then got me thinking about other cases. How might this be happening elsewhere? And I began a multi-sided interview project with 4 different graduate students who are listed here. With Michael Sembalis Roosterfer, we looked at members of sexual minorities in the US and also in France, and how this term is being used in the French context, different from the US context. And Laura and Nicole are going to present the work that we did together on coming out as undocumented and coming out as Mormon fundamentalist polygamist. And then Becca DiBernardo and I also examined people with gay and lesbian parents and the extent to which they were using this language of coming out. So what have we learned? Well, one of the themes from this project is, as I mentioned earlier, how does culture travel? You know, is it that coming out is simply in the air and easily accessible for anyone, regardless of their social position, or are some people more likely to, certain social networks make it easier or more likely that people are going to use this term? And we're finding some slightly different things across the different cases. So in the FAT case, it was clearly the case that, as I mentioned earlier, that social networks are playing a really important role in facilitating the movement of coming out from gay rights to FAT acceptance movement. And similarly, Laura and I found something very similar happening with the case of undocumented youth, where there were these networks that were facilitating the movement. But there are virtually no social networks between gay rights groups and Mormon fundamentalist polygamists. That may come as a huge surprise to you. But in fact, this is the case. And so in this case, the fact that the term was in the air was important, but it wasn't the whole story. We found that same-sex marriage and polygamy cases have been linked by what we call discursive networks, by public figures such as when public figures like Justice Scalia warned that legalizing same-sex marriage is going to open the door to polygamy. Right, and then there's others have also likened the issues in this way. And so we argue that this creates a discursive network, different from a social network, that allows the term to follow, in addition to it being in the air, which is also important. Now, another theme running across these is how does the origin of the term within gay rights shape the meaning that it has elsewhere? And we've already seen in the case of FAT rights that the origin of the term in gay rights activisms colors the term in FAT rights activisms and gives it power there. And this is also true in the case of the undocumented youth movement and plural marriage movements. The use of the term implicitly evokes a successful social movement and likens the identity in question to another group, gays and lesbians, for which there is growing social support. And so this is politically expedient. In France, interestingly enough, use of the term, which is always left in English, which creates a certain distance from it, right? So il a fait son coming out, we don't translate, it doesn't get translated, is infused with its association with the US, and specifically with negative French ideas about US identity politics. So it makes the concept, it's used, but it has a different meaning there. It's more fraught in the French context. Another theme is what does this term come to mean? Is it a public revelation, or can it also be done in a more private setting? So for gays and lesbians, the quintessential coming out experience was to parents. This is a private, intimate setting, but a very fraught and risky one. Likewise, narratives of coming out as fat also involves narratives of fat rights activists women confronting their mothers, telling their mothers that their weight was not up for negotiation, that they were drawing lines, and this is who they were, and this was important to them. In contrast, by the time this term arrived on the other side of the Atlantic in France, it was strongly associated with celebrities coming out in the media and not more intimate association. So the meaning there changed in translation to have a more public meaning. And interestingly enough, we also find this in the case of the undocumented youth movement and the Mormon fundamentalist polygamists. The term is used to speak more about very highly public and risky forms of revelation. As Laura will talk about, in the case of undocumented youth, there's a use of this other term to tell when talking about more private sharing in a less risky environment with a trusted other. So, why are these differences? Well, the French case, that's one explanation, but why the differences in the US case? Perhaps, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, the difference is that for sexual orientation and also for body size, private disclosures, especially with the family, are not perceived as safe, right? These are risky encounters. And whereas with undocumented status or the practice of polygamy, unlike undocumented status or the practice of polygamy, sexual orientation is often not shared with other members, with members of the family. So gay kids often typically don't have gay parents, right? That this is something that they have in common. And the same is often true for fatness, that sure, sometimes a fat kid will have fat parents, but often not, and even if they do, the parent may not be self-identified as fat, may be one of those thin people trapped in a fat body that won't, that hasn't come to terms with their own body size. So affirming difference in autonomy, whether it's I'm queer, get used to it, or I'm a sphere, get used to it, with family members is both personal, risky, and scary. Okay, another theme is that of visibility. And this is one that comes back to the original case of coming out as fat. So together, the cases also lead us to rethink the role of visibility in relation to stigma resistance. In his classic book, Stigma, sociologist Irving Goffman distinguishes between stigma that are visible, called discredited identities, and those that are non-visible, that discreditable stigma or identity. So when a stigma is non-visible, many will and can pass as not having that stigma. When the stigma is visible, they can't hide it, but they can still downplay it by doing what Goffman calls covering. And Kenji Yoshino, in his book, Covering, argues that coming out is a refusal to pass. And so in this sense, coming out should be technically, is conceptualized as a strategy for people with non-visible stigmas. And yet we saw with the fat acceptance activists that they're really talking about coming out as fat despite the fact that their stigma is visible. The polygamists and undocumented seem to present a case, a more typical case of revealing something hidden. But when we look a bit more closer, it's actually more complicated because there are variations in visibility. So for instance, with the polygamists, some of them are recognizable, as Nicole's going to talk about, by their clothing. And for many, not all, but some Latino people, their phenotype or the fact that they're Spanish speaking sometimes means that they're suspected, rightly or wrongly, of being undocumented. But of course, circling back to the original case, members of sexual minorities also vary in their ability to pass, with very gender non-conforming men or women being visibly marked as gay or lesbian. And in these cases, coming out as gay or lesbian never really meant revealing something hidden as much as acknowledging the elephant in the room. And so, these cases and how they vary in terms of visibility can also help us, I hope, rethink the original meaning and the importance of visibility in that original case. So with this, I will stop and move on to the other.
Hello. So I imagine that Abby's name is also here because she wrote this paper with me, which will be forthcoming in Social Problems, we're excited to say. So that's exciting. So most of the time when we think about polygamy, these are the images that we come up with. Women with very intricate braiding, women in 18th century prairie dresses and pastel coloring, very large families. That's actually one man and his wives, their children, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren. That's just one family unit. On average, with my participants, family sizes range from 21 to 36, with one family having closer to 400 children. The top corner is also Warren Jeffs and some of his child brides. That's usually what we think of when we have the idea of Mormon fundamentalist polygamy. But around 6 years ago, TLC put out a show called Sister Wives, which showed an entirely different brand of Mormon fundamentalism. It's hip, it's cool, they're so in love, they love each other, look, they're touching. Cody is there in the middle, everyone's like really happy, their hair is lovely. It's not in a braid. And so, bouncing off of with Abby, I worked on this for my undergrad thesis. I went to Utah, like, oh, look at this. And so this sort of came out of that. And around this time when the show was being launched, Cody Brown said, when we open ourselves up, those stereotypes that people have suddenly change. They change when they meet us. And this is part of our reason for essentially coming out. It's a story that needs to be told. So I went back to Utah a few times and did, in total, 34 interviews with 28 women and 4 men. And we talked about what it was like to be, you know, the new face and the old face of Mormon fundamentalist polygamy. And what we found was that there are, as Abby had mentioned, there's these discursive networks that are connecting Mormon fundamentalist polygamy to coming out language and politics. Now, as you were all very surprised to learn, there are no direct necessarily connections to LBG community with the Mormon fundamentalist groups, but more of this sort of cultural ubiquity with the term. One of the very prominent activists out there said, we should have civil rights just like any other minority or any other alternative lifestyle. And I think eventually it will come to that because there are so many alternative families out there. We just want to be considered as one. So for them, using coming out language in some ways is like saying, yeah, we want this too. But they have it, we want it. But as Abby had mentioned, there's also this sort of legal connection. In December of 2013, a federal court judge in Utah deemed that the ban against plural marriage was unconstitutional, using Lawrence v. Texas. So using previous gains by the gay pro-marriage movement, the pro-polygamy plural marriage movement is also trying to leak themselves, even though that was used as sort of a negative, right? Scalia saying, oh my gosh, if this happens, the polygamists are coming. And the polygamists are like, yes. And that's what so they changed their strategy away from freedom of religion to this sort of privacy, freedom of religion, freedom to due process. It's been working very well for them. And in combination with the Brown family here, people maybe no longer think of prairie dresses, war and jest, child marriage, coerced sex. Instead, they think of soccer moms and their 26 children, or not. Another thing that we found that they were doing, especially with the female participants, was this connection to feminism, which might seem odd, but that they're saying, look, we have more time. We have an additional domestic partner who's helping us with the children. So that means one of my participants said very comically, I can go play volleyball if I want to. And I was like, was that not on the table before? So she was like, I can play volleyball, I can go to college, I have someone who can stay with my kids, I have an extra wife. How hard it must be to just be an only wife. However, without, the problem with that thought is that what we came up with is that ultimately what they're doing is reinforcing patriarchal norms that are part of this religion. To get into having just a little bit of theological background, you have to have a priest holder, which is always a male, who gets you access with keys into heaven. You don't get into heaven without a male patriarch, and in the fundamentalist version, you don't get in without at least 2 or 3 wives to help you get in. Women are seen as more morally pure than men. That's why they need more women. So even though their culture is extremely patriarchal, they're hearkening on to feminism as another way of saying, we're palatable to mainstream community. Look, we're not marrying at 13. All of these women were over 18, college educated, and one of my participants was a medical doctor, a few lawyers, extremely well educated women who have chosen this life and said, this is feminism for me. Sort of that post-feministic, it's a choice, therefore it's feminism. So we found that these discursive networks are also harkening on to not just coming out language, but also to the more palatable. We have feminism on our side. I'm trying to think what else our other thing was. So in terms of making the group a little more palatable, to get away from this, a lot of our participants said, we are not them. No, absolutely not. I went to college, I got married at 22, I don't look like this. So that's common sometimes with these groups that are fighting for cultural recognition, is to distance themselves from groups that are participating in potentially taboo or dangerous activities. This happened before, and as we talk about in our paper with the gay rights movement, they distanced themselves from NAMBLA at one point, who was a part of the group, because it was bad for them. It was bad publicity to say that they were a part of this group. So to gain social rights, to gain access, we found, like in most social movements, there has to be some level of distancing. And so our very modern family here wants to say, no, I'm the person next door. I get cookies with you. I'm on the PTA. Our kids are in Boy Scouts together. We really don't look like this. These are not us. They don't represent our ideals. So please stop assuming that this is what we look like. And yeah.
All right, so thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about this project. It's been a while since I thought about it last, since we finally published the paper almost a year ago. It was accepted. It just came out this month, actually, in American Journal of Public Policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the undocumented immigrant youth movement and sort of how they've adopted this term of coming out. So if you don't know, the undocumented immigrant youth movement has actually grown in the past decade, looking at trying to increase resources provided to undocumented youth who came to the U.S. as children and are now here living without immigration status. So the movement has accomplished a lot of different things, including immigration reform, like the current Deferred Action Program, which creates access to work permits and protection from deportation for undocumented youth. The now defunct DREAM Act that has never passed Congress over the past, since 2001, it's been a long time, but there's been a lot of work towards DREAM Act. And at the time that we were doing this project, the DREAM Act was the thing that people were still working for, and this is now something that's kind of fallen out of the picture. Also creating other laws and legal changes on the state context and also in sort of local areas or on campuses. And then also trying to reframe the debate around undocumented immigration and trying to broaden what we think about when we think about undocumented immigrants. That they can be students, they can be people that you know, similar to what Nicole was talking about, that they're not just scary men crossing the border who are coming to attack you or something like that. So really trying to create those cultural shifts. So for the past 5 years now, there's been a lot of talk about coming out as undocumented or coming out as undocumented and unafraid, which is what we look at. And it really builds on this, a lot of it really started with this quote by Harvey Milk, right? So prominent gay rights activist, and he's quoted a lot within the movement as what he says here: brothers and sisters, you must come out to your parents, come out to your friends, if indeed they are your friends, come out to your neighbors, come out to your fellow workers. Once and for all, let's break down the myth and destroy the lies and distortions, right? And this quote really resonates a lot with undocumented youth who want to come out, who want to share their immigration status, who want to create change, who want to inspire other youth to not be afraid, right, to participate in this social movement. So this resonated a lot and was featured a lot in sort of recruitment material, I guess, or advertisements for the annual National Coming Out of the Shadows Day or National Coming Out of the Shadows Month. Other things calling on undocumented youth to be, refuse to be intimidated, scared, and ashamed, right? So come and participate in this broader political movement for undocumented communities more generally. And since then, this term has really been taken up. That happened in 2010. It's been taken up and used widely in newspapers. If you Google coming out as undocumented, all kinds of things will pop up from newspapers and events and pictures and all kinds of things. So really this project sought to dig into what cultural work went into making this happen, right? We know that this term transitioned to the undocumented movement. We really wanted to understand sort of how did it transition and what made it successfully transition. So what specific aspects of coming out resonate in the case of undocumented young adults? And then how has cultural innovation transformed coming out to use in this new social movement context, right? So really looking at what work went on here to make this work in this new place. So we draw on 28 interviews with undocumented students, and these are all college students in Southern California from 9 different colleges and universities trying to tap different social networks, really drawing on my own networks from my other research, all in 2011. So we also split the sample between leaders and rank and file members. So people that are just kind of tangentially or baseline involvement in the organizations, and other people that were leaders. So the co-chairs of the organizations, the secretary, the membership chair, but people that had an investment in organizing and a connection to the larger movement discourse. And then also 5 individuals who identified as LGBTQ. And then in addition to these 28 interviews, I also did 4 informant interviews with members of IJL, which is a community organization in Chicago, the Immigrant Youth Justice League, which I think is the best name ever. It's very superhero. Who is sort of credited with starting the Coming Out as a Documented campaign, holding the first event, and contributing to the broad use of this within the movement nationally. And then also participant observations that I did at Coming Out events, Coming Out of the Shadows events throughout LA and different campuses in Southern California. So sort of to set the scene, thinking about barriers to coming out, there's a lot of fear of detention and deportation, particularly before DACA, and particularly in this current state where there's ramped up deportation enforcement internally. There's high levels, record levels of deportation. More people have been deported since 1997, since ever in the history of the United States, right? Which is really, makes this a really reality for this population. And because of that, the youth are getting lots of messages about concealing their immigration status, which is what Carla talks about when she first came to the US, what her parents told her. They said, one thing that my parents made sure to tell me was not to get into any trouble because I wasn't the same as everybody else. And I know they were trying to do it to protect me. All I remember was my parents telling me, don't tell anyone that you were born in Mexico. If anyone asks, you were born here, but you were taken to Mexico and now you're back. Right, so creating these elaborate backstories to hide immigration status. And these messages, right, they stick with you. These are things that you learn as a child. You learn not to run in the street and do all these kinds of things. And that was a similar kind of messaging as you shouldn't tell people about your immigration status. You shouldn't run in the street. And it takes a lot to teach yourself, oh, I should run in the street, right? You have to like learn the opposite of these messages that you had growing up. So these are some of those barriers that people are having to deal with. And these, sort of from family members, but also from the media, from friends who are telling them similar things if they're talking to their friends about it. But despite those barriers, there's also motivations to reveal their immigration status, right? In particular, there are 5 main motivations that we identify, 3 of which are individual motivations that we talk about. So accessing resources, particularly in high school, is really important. Learning about how to go to college, how to get a job, how to get a driver's license, or really that you can't do any of those things. Or if you can, what ways can you do them and navigate your immigration status. So this is a really big point for undocumented youth. Having to tell their immigration status to somebody else in order to access those resources, which is what Selena talked about here. Trying to figure out how to go to college and telling her teacher for the first time. Also wanting to stop unwanted questioning. Not wanting to have to constantly have this conversation and hide your immigration status, right? Which is what David talks about in the context of telling somebody who he's thinking about dating, right? And not wanting to have to constantly make up excuses for why he's not in school or why it's difficult to go to school, why he doesn't have financial aid. So sort of getting around that, saying, you know what, it's just because I'm undocumented and you need to stop asking me all of these things all the time, right? And then also wanting to affirm an authentic self, which is what Jason talks about here, telling his friend, because this is what friends do, right? He shared things with me, I need to share things back with him, and we need to be true to ourselves. So these are all very individual level motivations, right? Trying to access things for yourself or trying to make yourself feel better, build your relationships. There's also collective motivations, which are more about increasing access to resources for the documented community as a whole. And these kind of split up into 2 categories. Raising awareness among other undocumented youth, right, which is not particularly scary, right? It's somebody who you know is going to be, is going to understand, right? They're not going to judge you or call immigration or whatever it is, right? Which is what Sam talks about, revealing his immigration status to a counselor, a conference of high school counselors who are wanting more information about how to better support their undocumented students, right? So this is a place that he can assume is safe and so more comfortable. It's not the same as talking to one person, but it's more comfortable than just going out in the street and yelling it and not knowing who else is there. In addition to that, there's also this general public revelation trying to create pro-immigrant legislation and policy, policy changes, which is what David talks about in terms of agreeing to be on national television and reveal his immigration status in order to create support for the DREAM Act in this case, right? And more recently, also just other kinds of immigration reform. So that being a very public choice, revealing your status, putting yourself at risk, more so than just talking to people that you know might be, is probably supportive, right? Having to interact with those unknown audiences. So given that background, I'm really thinking about how this movement harnessed coming out, right, in this new context. So on March 2010, there was the first Coming Out of the Shadows event in Chicago. And they then took it to a national meeting of a national level immigrant youth coalition, which now doesn't exist anymore, the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, and really trying to adapt coming out to this new context. So Ulysses talks about this being part of the Harvey Milk speech, right? Just specifically referencing that, that members connected to it, that it was similar to what's going on in the immigrant community where people felt isolated, threatened, different kinds of things, right, in these different places. So drawing connections to the LGBTQ movement between the undocumented community, right? But even though there were these similarities, there was a recognition that there are differences, right? Which is why they decided, well, we need to sort of change this, right? Do a little cultural innovation to make it fit better, to resonate more, which is what Rico talks about. Using the messaging of living in the shadows, which is used by the media, used a lot with people. We took basically the immigrants in the shadows, the coming out, combine all of that, and you have this coming out rally where undocumented youth publicly declare their status and talk about their story. Right? So really meshing this pre-existing cultural schema that's in the era about shadows and combining it with coming out to create this newer term that connects more to undocumented youth, right? The closet might not work because it's a small place, it's just you, whereas we have the shadows that already exist that's bigger, right? That encompasses this whole community of 11 million people, right? And that kind of combines those two things and makes it resonate more for this population. It's also strategic because it engages the media, it's more catchy, so there's a lot going on there. And because of that, trying to utilize this coming out, there was this decision, so the national organization created a guide to coming out. And one that really resonates with the coming out is LGBTQ kind of way we think about it, where coming out means anything. Telling somebody one-on-one, talking to other undocumented youth, being out in the media, being at a rally, or actually engaging in civil disobedience, because this is the same time period where there became a lot more civil disobedience around immigration issues. So really trying to refer to all instances of revealing your immigration status as coming out. This, however, does not filter down into sort of everyday life. Instead, there's these sort of other vocabularies that remain and that were pre-existing that have to be accommodated in order to kind of maintain participation of this larger group. So coming out becomes associated with high-risk activities that are for collective motivations, particularly around creating policy change, which is what Carlos talks about, right? It's about being in the audience that's more conservative, and it's going to be a little bit scary, right? That's the coming out experience. So it's this very specific kind of revealing that becomes labeled as coming out, where there's lots of risk entailed. And this allows them to maintain another sort of phrase that has already been developed in the movement of sharing your story, which is more low-risk collective motivations, usually of empowering other undocumented youth. So sharing your stories so they kind of see you're going through the same thing. We can encourage them. They can become part of the organization, access support networks and resources. Really, the substance of these conversations are the same, the coming out or the sharing your story, but the framing of that action is different because of how they want to categorize the audience that you're speaking to, one that's more predictable and safe, and one that's more high risk and conservative or scary or potentially risky. And that also leaves a third level of vocabulary of just telling, right? It's just as I just told somebody that I was undocumented. Because it's just this one-on-one conversation, it's low risk, that they're trying to access resources. It's sort of, it's an everyday activity, so we're gonna use everyday language. So by sort of creating coming out to just be one type of these experiences of sharing our immigration status, it actually allows the maintenance of these other ways of framing that action, and allows people to signal the level of risk. So you can say, oh, will you come and participate in this coming out event? And the person can know, oh, that's going to be risky. Or, you know, oh, would you like to come and share your story at my organization? And they're like, oh, okay, so it's going to be fine, right? And that allows for some you know, knowledge to be easily shared about what they're walking into. And then in addition to that, the coming out, so there's more cultural innovation about ways to signal coming out without saying coming out, mainly because there is no way, there's no desire to control what people actually say in their narratives. There's a lot of desire to allow people to say whatever they feel comfortable saying. And because of that, there was no, like, you have to start your thing by saying coming out, or I'm coming out. So because there was no way to enforce that top down, there had to be more ways to signal that there was coming out. So there was labeling things as coming out of the shadows. This is a flyer from one of the events. There's shirts that say I'm undocumented. People can wear, right, which is visually coming out. There's signs, undocumented and not afraid, which captures the essence of coming out and being not afraid. Also, this is a really common chant at rallies. They used to start chanting undocumented, unafraid. And then since it's been transformed into undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic, that we shouldn't have to apologize for our immigration status, that we should just be who we are, and that's fine. So there's all this cultural innovation. And even with all of that, right, that's still very movement level and to some extent top down. But in terms of everyday use, not everybody adopts it, right? It's really dependent on people's positionality. So in the interviews, we left space for people to use coming out whenever they wanted, rather than me introducing it to the conversation, just sort of letting it emerge naturally, and then asking about it at the end. And sort of in that space of unprompted space, 16 of the 29 individuals, I think 28 actually, 16 of 28 spontaneously used coming out. However, most of those are leaders, right? 11 out of 12 leaders. So by far, people that are steeped in movement level speech, right? Or movement level politics that have gone to the meetings that are saying, we're using this coming out term now, and this is what it means. And then also, people sort of rank and file were using it, but only in relation to events. So they talk about going to a coming out of the shadows event, right? So very still sticking into movement level activities and not necessarily just their own lives. And then all 5 of the LGBTQ identified individuals use coming out, which isn't surprising, right? And using it both to refer to immigration status and sexual orientation in everyday life. So they could talk about coming out as undocumented and coming out as queer, sort of in the same sentences, in this sort of everyday way that leaders were also using it. So this really shows us that there's an adaptation of the similar case of it, invisible identity. It's really trying to bring it back to how these cases tie together. That's really all I like to get at. And then that there's cultural innovation to increase resonance. So I think it's something that we need to think about, that there's all this innovation going in there in order to enable it to go into all these different cases. And in this case, to increase recruitment and participation, to allow audience-specific vocabularies, to facilitate mobilization, and also to develop new movement tactics.
I have my own coming out story, but you're not going to hear it. There was a time in my life when I told it to many, many people, and I heard many other coming out stories. There was a time when I heard so many coming out stories that I said if I heard another one, I was going to sign up for apparative therapy. Before it never came to that. And I've also gotten hoarse marching to the streets of New York, crying out with also thousands of other people out of the closets and into the streets. Not only getting hoarse, but getting exhilarated as the sound reverberated in those narrow streets as one marched through. So I've also played my very small part in turning this notion into a political rallying cry. But I haven't actually thought much about the question of coming out as what it means and how it came to have this importance. So I was very grateful to have been asked to comment on this panel, and I'm particularly grateful to the presenters for having presented such a remarkable variety of thoughtful and engaging papers on this question. It gave me a chance to think a little more carefully about coming out. Thinking more carefully, you'll notice that the two personal tidbits I mentioned at the beginning are different. One is a personal narrative, a personal coming out story, and the other is a political strategy based on coming out. The second presumes the first, but it moves into a different area, and it has much more ambitious goals. How did this happen? How did a moment of personal transition? I came out into the gay world, I came out to my friends. How did this become a political strategy? I want to try and speculate on how this happened historically. Coming out emerged as a political strategy and was efficacious in a particular historical context. I think it's important that we should keep this in mind as we look to the future and study how coming out might be efficacious in new contexts. I was surprised actually by how little I could find in my library. When I looked around, I didn't have time to do a large research project, but I looked at the books that I happened to have. How little I could find on this question about how how this strategy emerged as a political strategy. One thing I did discover, however, is that it happened very quickly. Stonewall was June of 1969. By October, November of 1969, one was seeing the cry to come out as a political action that people should engage in. And yet, even in this context, when I looked around at a few anthology of early gay liberation documents, even in that context, I was surprised to see how the argument for coming out was still couched in political terms. Less stress, more honesty, authenticity, and so forth. Although it was becoming a political cry, you should do this, you should do it for personal reasons, primarily, rather than for the political consequences it might have for the larger movement. So why was this so effective? Perhaps unintended. So it was not even intended by the liberationists who made the challenge. Why was this such an effective political strategy? And as I'm speculating on this, I wish I'd had more help, and I may be completely wrong, but I'm going to offer a few speculations on why that was the case. And I'm going to go back to a period earlier, around 1950, which I come back to over and over again, and I can't talk about it as much as I'd like to. But there's kind of a new dynamic that's established around the year of 1950. This is after many decades of change, but you can see it becomes visible and tangible at this moment. Sort of a disaggregation of same-sex and cross-gender, where it becomes possible to think not only in sort of elite literature, but also in the popular mind, because these things became known quite quickly, of homosexuality divorced of cross-gender, and of transsexuality divorced of homosexuality. And so we had these notions. Now, of course, gender, nonconformity, and homosexuality continue to be linked in all sorts of ways. But this was a strong paradigm that began to become very important in the culture. Homosexuality not necessarily cross-gender, and transsexuality not necessarily homosexual. This also relied on the fact that these became hidden pathologies. It was just in 1952 that the first DSM came out, which formally identified homosexuality as a psychopathology. But this combination of factors, the homosexual, the transsexual, and the hiddenness of it all, created a dynamic of exposure and disclosure. It can't be read on the body necessarily anymore. So one sees then from that period, I think, from around 1950, this dialectic play out in US history. One sees the state, medicine, who tried to discover and expose these ill people, these perverts in the body politic, or also individuals who sought to disclose their status. The leaders of the homophile movement, one can say. I also say that about Christine Jorgensen in precisely this period, who chose for herself a life of being out as a transsexual woman. She easily could have passed, and she did so out of a sense of political responsibility. She spoke for the sake of others for whom I am a representation of themselves. So already there's a kind of disclosure for political purposes at the time that the world around was trying to expose for terrible purposes, actually. And this is another thing I'd like to talk about for a moment. it may be known, it may not be so well known, that the 50s especially, and then into the 60s, was the worst time for homosexuals in the United States. It was the period, the post-war period, beginning even in the 40s, when the federal government became actively involved in rooting out homosexuals from the federal government. President Eisenhower signed the an executive order prohibiting employment of homosexuals that wasn't revoked until 1973. Thousands and thousands of people lost their jobs. Thousands of people's lives were ruined as a consequence. Local police enforcement was also involved in trapping people, exposing people, ruining lives, tens of thousands of people. Oh, I have a few figures here. They're quite remarkable. In San Francisco in 1959, 40 to 60 men and women were arrested every single week in bar streets in San Francisco. In 1955, 1,400 people in Boise, Idaho were interrogated and forced to give the names of the homosexuals they knew. Now, this was a fact of life for lesbians and gay men in the United States in the 50s and the 60s. And so I want to bring this up because it was more than just homosexuals can often pass and they choose to come out. In this context, it was crucial to hide, because not only was it crucial to hide because your life could be ruined, but you felt fearful and endangered even while hiding, because there was a whole state apparatus that was engaged to try and find you out and expose you. Now, this is completely hypothetical on my part, but I wonder if one of the reasons why coming out was so efficacious was it prevented this. It diffused this mechanism. If I've already come out, I can no longer fear being exposed. I'm tired of the pressure, of the fear I experience living in this world, which is trying to find me out and ruin my life. That's no longer possible once I've already come out. That's my first speculation. So it's not just a sense of personal wholeness, but it's freeing oneself from the vulnerability of entrapment by one's government. Now, the second reason why I think it was particularly efficacious from the more immediate context. A more immediate context in which, for instance, thanks to the women's movement, the personal was political. A personal coming out is a political coming out. I think there's two ways in which the particular situation of lesbians and gay men made this particularly efficacious. First of all, it shows, and this is an argument that's been made many, many times, it shows straight people in the world around that there are many queers that they already knew. And this over time changes opinion. And although this has actually worked, the idea that when people who you've known all along, I'm really, again, as Christians, I'm the same person. You liked me before, why can't you like me now that you know that I'm lesbian or gay? And this has proved a very powerful and effective strategy. Also, once someone has come out, that person has a stake in the broader politics of coming out. And here I think there's a difference. You can be a woman who supports the women's movement from the sidelines, and then you can be an activist in the movement, but then you can go back to being a supporter on the sidelines without too much difficulty. You can't be in the closet and then come out and then easily go back to being unknown for being lesbian or gay. There's a way in which once you've taken that step, it's irrevocable in a certain way, and your investment in the success of the political movement is perhaps more acute as a result. So there's a few reasons why at that moment. There's yet another reason. This, as you also all know, was a time of mass demonstrations and social unrest that had been shown to be effective, marches, zaps, and so forth. I want to talk about flaunting it. I question, actually, as I read the first article about the fat activists, and first you were very conscientious about all the different differentiations, and I think, no, that isn't true. And then, of course, at the end you ended up by saying, actually, it isn't true. There's much more. These distinctions turned out to be, in many ways, artificial. I think there's always an aspect of flaunting it to coming out. And which sees it in the most anodyne kinds of coming out, but also the coming out of a drag queen or dykes on bikes or some kind of obvious lesbian or gay type has an aspect of in your face. And I think the fat activists are doing this in a very way that's very much the same. And it's not always coming out from a hidden position, and it wasn't even always for lesbians and gay men coming out from a hidden position. There's another aspect of coming out which is flaunting it, which was used also very much at the time. So that's because of this, and then doing this in the streets at this particular moment when so much was going on was another way it was efficacious. Finally, AIDS. Lots of people came out in the context of the AIDS catastrophe. First of all, as we know, tragically, people who became sick and then hadn't been out to their families or their world and came out. But also many people around them who came out to support because their lives were impacted. Many people who would not otherwise have come out, faced with the virulent homophobia that was unleashed at the beginning of the AIDS catastrophe, but also for all sorts of other reasons of support for friends and so forth. It was another moment of massive coming out, as a consequence of which, despite the devastating losses, the LGBT movement emerged actually much stronger by 1990 than it had beforehand. And again, despite the virulent homophobia that was circulated at the beginning, queer people were also seen more sympathetically by the population at large, because people saw people suffering, they saw networks of support, we sort of humanized queer people in a way that hadn't been possible before. Another way in which sort of coming out sort of educates the world around. So I think that, just to review, I have no idea how much time I have left. I'm doing okay? It seems to me there are specific historical circumstances that made coming out particularly effective political strategy for the LGBTQ movement. First, in the 50s and 60s, one was living in a world where homosexuality was a hidden pathology, where the threat of entrapment or exposure by the government was real and could be catastrophic. Disclosure neutralized that threat. In the 70s and 80s, it was immediate contact where the person was political, or direct action in the streets, and political action was common. Coming out was a paradigmatic example of how the personal was political, how personal transition turns one into a political actor. It's tailor-made for such a context. This was true in the 70s, but it was true in a heightened sense in the 80s that confronted by the AIDS epidemic. Finally, there's the general fact that in the post-war period, homosexuality had been constructed as a hidden illness, a contagion, a threat to children and families. Those who come out counter this construction by being able to say, I'm the same person I was before I came out, you just didn't know, I wasn't a threat then, and I'm no more now. Over time, this did change opinions, and this is one of the most important political consequences of coming out. And it had a snowballing effect. Once some people came out, opinions became changed, it became easy for other people to come out. It was no longer such a big deal. And as we know, it has had remarkable success. The successes of the LGBT movement in the last 30 years are just it's amazing. One never would have expected these things to have happened. Does it have a future? With regard to LGBTQ activism, I'm not sure, actually. It seems to me that coming out might have run its course and fulfilled its promise as a political strategy. Of course, in personal lives, it continues to be something that people have to deal with all the time. I asked about trans activism. Christine Jorgensen, I said one could say that she came out or herself and saw that as a political move. Sandy Stone, in her essay in 1991, says that, I was talking to Kristen beforehand, whether she actually uses the term coming out, but she clearly advocates that transsexuals should stop passing, because there are political reasons to do so. But I don't think, and again I've confirmed this with Kristen, who I think is a better expert than I, it actually plays a role in trans politics, even now, the way it had in lesbian and gay politics. Well, what about the other movements that we've been speaking about today? First of all, as everyone acknowledges, it has come into general circulation and is available for anyone to use in any context that he or she chooses. And of course, this is true of language. There's nothing the least bit surprising about this. No one owns words. No one owns strategies. They circulate widely. And there's no surprise, it's not at all surprising that people hoping to affect political change would adapt and change words and strategies that others have used. I have a few more comments, like I say, very few time left. I guess what I really want to end by asking is, in the cases that people have mentioned, I can't go through them individually, one sees some cases where it's the leaders that seem to have brought these words in, or cases in which it was people who were involved in that movement, the fat activist movement, the immigrant rights movement, and LGBT movements who brought these terms in. how far has it seeped down? How lasting do you think it will be that this idea of coming out will be efficacious in these movements? And my question really then comes down to be, as I've tried to sketch a political context in which coming out worked as a political strategy for LGBT people, do you see this is a political context where coming out will work for these other movements that you spoke about? Thank you.